My ex-girlfriend and I had a volatile relationship, and we often clashed. On a weekend trip to the mountains for sightseeing and hiking, we hoped to rekindle things, but by the second night, a massive argument erupted in our hotel room. Unable to stay in the same room, I decided against spending $150 on another hotel room and drove a short distance to a nearby motel where a room cost just $50. I thought some space might help us cool off and improve things by morning. When I arrived at the motel, I noticed the door to the room next to mine was wide open. A faint blue glow from a TV screen illuminated the room, but I couldn't see what was on the screen. No one seemed to be inside, but I didn't linger. I walked to my room, which was modest but typical for the price: a queen-sized bed with a floral cover, a small sofa, and a TV. I wasn't tired, so I laid on the bed, playing games on my phone with the TV on. Before long, I heard a strange noise. Assuming it came from the TV, I turned it off, but the sound persisted. It was muffled, coming from the room next door. At first, I couldn't tell if it was people arguing, a TV, or something more sinister. The noise grew unsettling, but I tried to brush it off and go to sleep. Then, the pounding started. Loud, deliberate bangs on the wall separating my room from the one next door. Startled, I got up and listened closely. The banging happened again. My heart raced, but I decided to confront whoever was on the other side. I knocked on the open door of the neighboring room and called out, asking if someone needed help. There was no response. The TV was still on, glowing faintly, but the sound was gone. Hesitantly, I stepped inside. The room was empty. The bathroom door was open, the light off, and no one was in sight. Confused, I approached the TV. The screen displayed nothing but a blank blue glow, but a sticky note was attached to it. I peeled it off and read the message, "Check under the bed." Panic surged through me. I dropped the note, bolted out of the room, and slammed the door shut. Back in my room, I locked the door and latched the chain. Trembling, I texted my girlfriend to tell her what had happened. She immediately called me. As I began explaining, loud bangs echoed from the wall again. I put the phone on speaker, and she heard them too. She urged me to leave either to my car or the front desk. I ran to the front desk and told the clerk what had happened, demanding he check the room and refund my money. He looked at me calmly and said no one was staying in the rooms next to mine. Both were vacant. My insistence finally convinced him to investigate. He unlocked the room next door and stepped inside. This time, the TV was off, the room dark, and the sticky note was gone. Even when he checked under the bed, nothing was there. He refused to refund me, but at that point, I didn't care. I drove back to the hotel, reunited with my girlfriend, and stayed in her room for the night. Whatever happened in that motel room remains a mystery and one I hope to never unravel. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, a weekend away from the stress of our jobs and the daily grind. Jake and I had been planning this trip for weeks, eager to escape the chaos of the city. Our destination was a small, out-of-the-way town that we'd heard about from a colleague of mine. The town was known for its historic sites, charming streets, and old-world architecture, a perfect place to disconnect and relax for a couple of days. We left early on a Saturday morning, feeling free as we sped down the highway, our playlist blasting and windows down. The first few hours passed uneventfully as we navigated winding country roads, surrounded by endless stretches of forests and fields. Everything was going as planned, and we were in high spirits, laughing and talking about nothing in particular. But somewhere along the way, things started to take a turn for the worse. The sky began to darken in the distance, an ominous wall of clouds rolling in faster than we expected. The forecast hadn't mentioned anything about severe weather, but nature didn't seem to care about predictions. Before we knew it, the sky turned black, and rain began to pour in thick, heavy sheets, so intense that the windshield wipers couldn't keep up. We slowed down, trying to keep the car steady on the slick road, but visibility quickly dropped to nearly zero. We were miles from any town, our GPS signal had cut out, and neither of us had any idea where we were. Panic started to creep in, though we didn't say it out loud. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere, in a storm that showed no signs of letting up. Jake squinted through the rain-soaked windshield, scanning the roadside for any sign of life: a gas station, a rest stop, anything. but the road stretched on endlessly, flanked by thick trees that loomed like shadowy figures in the storm. Just as I was beginning to worry that we might have to sleep in the car, Jake nudged me and pointed ahead. "Look," he said, and I followed his gaze to a faint, flickering light in the distance. As we drew closer, the light became more distinct, and we could finally make out the words on the sign Motel. The neon letters were faded and barely holding on, one of the letters sputtering on and off in a rhythmic, eerie fashion. The building itself looked ancient, more like a relic than a place anyone would willingly stay. The wood siding was weathered and cracked, the windows covered in grime, and the parking lot was completely empty. It looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years, maybe decades. Jake and I exchanged a glance, but neither of us said anything. We both knew we didn't have much of a choice. The storm was getting worse, and we couldn't keep driving in those conditions. We pulled into the lot and parked close to the entrance, hoping to make a quick dash inside. The rain pounded on the roof of the car like 1,000 tiny hammers, and the wind howled around us, making the whole car shudder. "Let's just stay the night and get out of here in the morning," Jake muttered as we grabbed our bags. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was something about the motel that set me on edge, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It felt wrong. But I pushed the feeling aside. It was just a storm. Just an old, run-down building. Nothing more. We rushed inside, eager to escape the cold and wet. The lobby was dimly lit, with only a few dusty lamps casting a weak glow. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing patches of mold beneath, and the air was thick with a musty, decaying odor. I wrinkled my nose, but Jake didn't seem to notice. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his skin pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into his face. His clothes were old-fashioned, a wrinkled suit that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. "Looking for a room?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. His hollow eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I felt like he could see right through me, like he was peering into my very soul. "Yeah," Jake said, stepping forward. Just for the night, the man didn't say anything else. He just reached under the counter and handed Jake an old-fashioned key, one with a large metal tag attached to it. "Room 7. He gave us a strange, crooked smile as we walked away, and I shivered, despite the warmth inside. We found our room at the end of a long, narrow hallway. The floor creaked under our feet, and the walls seemed to close in on us the farther we walked. By the time we reached room 7, I was feeling more than a little claustrophobic. I wanted to get out of there, but the storm raged outside and we had nowhere else to go. The room was just as bad as the lobby, maybe worse. The bed was sagging in the middle, the carpet stained and sticky, and the air was thick with dust. Jake tried to joke about how the place looked like something out of a horror movie, but I wasn't laughing. There was something oppressive about the room, something that made it hard to breathe. I felt like we were being watched, though there was no one else around. We settled in, both of us exhausted from the long drive. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the storm and the unfamiliar surroundings were playing tricks on my mind. But as the night wore on, my unease only grew. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the rain pounding against the window. Jake was already asleep, his soft snores the only noise in the room. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard something strange. It started as a faint whispering sound, barely audible over the storm. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more distinct the voices became. They were speaking in hushed tones, too quiet for me to make out the words, but there was something unsettling about the way they whispered, as if they were coming from just outside the door. My heart began to race. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, but the whispers seemed to move. Now they were behind the walls, now just outside the window, now in the hallway. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting my fear get the better of me. But then the voices grew louder, more urgent, like they were calling out to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and opened the door, expecting to find an empty hallway. But what I saw made my blood run cold. There, at the far end of the corridor, stood a figure, a shadowy silhouette, too far away for me to make out any details. It was just standing there, motionless, staring at me. Before I could react, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out. Panic seized me, and I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were louder now, filling the room, swirling around me like a chorus of unseen voices. I backed away from the door, trembling, my mind racing. I wanted to wake Jake, but part of me was too terrified to move. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. It was so cold I could see my breath in the air, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I turned toward Jake, but he was still sound asleep, completely oblivious to the terror unfolding around us. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a loud thud from the room next door, the room that was supposed to be empty. The sound was so loud that it shook the walls. I froze, torn between the urge to investigate and the overwhelming sense of dread that told me to stay put. Before I could make up my mind, the door to our room creaked open on its own. I stared in horror as the door slowly swung inward, revealing the dark hallway beyond. For what felt like an eternity, I couldn't move. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. The whispers were deafening now, filling the room with a suffocating, sinister energy. I slammed the door shut and barricaded it with a chair, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep, I couldn't. I just sat there, wide-eyed and trembling, waiting for the dawn. When the first rays of sunlight finally crept through the window, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The oppressive feeling that had hung in the air all night was gone, and the whispers had fallen silent. Jake woke up, completely unaware of what had happened. When I told him about the whispers, the shadow in the hallway, and the door creaking open, he just laughed it off. "You must have been dreaming," he said. "This place is creepy, but it's not haunted." But when we stepped out into the hallway to leave, we both noticed something strange. The door to the room next to ours, the one where I'd heard the thud, was wide open. Inside, there was nothing except a single wooden chair in the center of the room, facing the wall. There were no other guests at the motel. As we sped away from the motel, the oppressive feeling slowly lifted, but a lingering chill remained. Even now, I can't shake the sense that we narrowly escaped something far worse than just a storm. Some doors are better left unopened. Driving through Ohio on a long road trip, I felt exhaustion creeping in. It was getting harder to keep my eyes open, so I decided to stop for the night. I pulled into a small town called Xenia, a quiet, seemingly forgotten place. As I scanned the area for a place to stay, I spotted a sign for the Xenia Country Inn. The building looked tired and worn, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign, but I didn't care. All I needed was a few hours of rest before hitting the road again. I parked in the mostly empty lot and headed to the front office, a cramped little room in the corner of one of the two motel buildings. Inside, an elderly man sat behind a desk, engrossed in a newspaper. The air was stifling, made worse by the loud buzzing of a rusty table fan. I stood there awkwardly for a moment before he finally looked up. Without a greeting or a smile, he muttered, "65. I assumed he meant the price for a night's stay and handed him my credit card. Hoping for a little extra privacy, I asked if I could get a corner room. His response was a flat no. Clearly, customer service wasn't part of the deal here. He slid an old-fashioned key across the desk, attached to a blank keyring. No electronic key cards in this place. I took the key and headed back across the lot to my room. The parking lot was eerily quiet, with only 2 other cars parked under dim streetlights. It felt like a ghost town. When I reached my room, the lock on the door proved stubborn. It took several tries before I managed to get it open. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by a peculiar smell, a mix of stale cotton and something sour, almost like vomit. The room was just as decrepit as the rest of the motel, with a threadbare blue carpet, an old couch, a battered coffee table, and a creaky bed. After a moment's hesitation, I decided against asking for a different room. Judging by the state of this place, all the rooms probably smelled. I shut the door and tried locking it, but the lock was just as difficult as before. After a minute of struggling, I thought I might have broken it. However, when I tested the door, it wouldn't budge. That gave me some small comfort. I collapsed onto the bed, the springs groaning under my weight, and reached for the TV remote. Of course, it didn't work. Frustrated, I threw the remote aside, pulled the thin blanket over myself, and tried to sleep. A loud thump jolted me awake. My heart raced as I turned to the window. A man stood there staring directly at me. He knocked again, louder this time, and began speaking. "Hey, please let me in. I'm hurt." "I need help," he said, his voice filled with urgency. My instinct screamed that something was off. He'd clearly seen me in bed, but I yelled back for him to go to the front desk. He didn't leave. Instead, he continued pleading, his voice growing more desperate. I stayed frozen, refusing to move. After what felt like an eternity, he finally walked away. I waited a few more minutes before peeking through the curtains to confirm he was gone. Shaken, I got up to check the door, giving it a few firm pulls to ensure it wouldn't open. Then, I closed the curtains tightly, blocking out the window entirely. The encounter had left me rattled, but as the minutes passed, my nerves began to calm. Eventually, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. My dreams were bizarre. I found myself in an empty supermarket, running frantically from a manager who was chasing me for no clear reason. Suddenly, my dream shifted, overtaken by a strange clicking sound. The sound grew louder and more persistent until it pulled me out of sleep. The room felt colder than before. Groggily, I reached for the blanket, only to realize it had been pulled off me. That's when I saw him. A tall, shadowy figure stood at the foot of the bed, looming over me. Before I could scream, he hissed, "Shay, don't move." Paralyzed with fear, I barely managed to nod. He told me he wouldn't hurt me if I stayed quiet and still. Then he asked where my wallet was. My voice trembled as I told him it was in my jeans, lying on the floor. The figure moved toward my jeans and began rummaging through the pockets. I heard the rustling as he pulled out my wallet. He asked if I had anything else. I shook my head, barely able to breathe. Without another word, he left the room. As soon as the door closed, I leapt from the bed and tried to lock it again, wrestling with the same stubborn mechanism. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called the police. Their response was slow and unhelpful, but they eventually arrived. Back at the front desk, the old man replayed the security footage. The intruder had been wearing a mask and a hat, obscuring his face. There was no way to identify him. Frustrated and scared, I demanded a refund and left. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in a well-lit lot miles away from that wretched motel. I canceled all my credit cards and thanked my luck that I hadn't been carrying much cash. The experience left me shaken and taught me a valuable lesson: never let exhaustion lead you to a place that feels unsafe. Sometimes it's better to keep driving,